If you agree that some people carry quiet heroism the world will never understand, make sure to like and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story you only hear once. I was halfway through demonstrating how to stop severe bleeding using a tourniquet, standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of the community center's multipurpose room, when the world I thought I'd left behind came crashing back in. Now, I have to start this from the beginning, because this wasn't supposed to be my life anymore. For the last 3 years, I've been instructor Ava, the girl in her late 20s who cracks bad jokes while teaching first aid to rookies, whether they're fresh-faced volunteers or old-timers brushing up on skills they pray they'll never need. My students knew me as calm, patient, the kind of person who could explain CPR in a way that made sense even to a panicked teenager. What they didn't know was that instructor Ava was a mask, a quiet life I built over the ruins of another identity. Unit Valkyrie. That name hasn't been spoken in my presence for years. Not since the day I swore I'd never put myself back in the kind of situations where you have to decide who lives and who dies in under 30 seconds. But on that Tuesday afternoon, right as I was tightening a band around a mannequin's arm to show proper pressure placement, the radio clipped to my hip, which I kept for emergencies at the center, let out a sharp burst of static. At first, I thought it was one of our local medics calling in, maybe a car accident nearby. But then came the voice, sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Unit Valkyrie, immediate deployment requested. Priority 1. My hands froze mid-demo. My students stared at me, some confused, others curious. I hadn't heard that call sign in 5 years, and hearing it again felt like being shoved backward into a cold, dark memory I thought I'd buried. I forced myself to breathe evenly, giving them a tight smile as I set down the tourniquet. Keep practicing that knot, I told them, trying to sound casual. Then I stepped out of the room before the questions could start. In the hall, I unclipped the radio, pressing it close to my ear. "This is Valkyrie," I said, the name feeling strange in my mouth. The reply came instantly, a voice I hadn't heard since my last mission. "Reyes. We've got an incident, industrial collapse, zone Echo 5. Multiple casualties, hazardous conditions. One of ours is trapped." My pulse kicked up. One of ours didn't just mean anyone. It meant someone from the old unit. I wanted to say no, wanted to tell him he had the wrong person. But then he said the name of the person trapped, and every wall I'd built in my mind collapsed. Captain Hayes, the man who had dragged me out of a kill zone when my legs stopped working. The man I'd never properly thanked. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that debt. "Send me the coordinates," I said, my voice low. By the time I reached my truck, my body was already on autopilot. I pulled a weathered black duffel from under the back seat, the one I swore I'd never open again. My students probably thought it was extra training gear. Inside wasn't gauze and plastic dummies. It was tactical medic equipment, reinforced trauma kits, climbing harnesses, even the old sidearm I told myself I kept just in case. The drive to Echo 5 was long enough for doubts to creep in. I'd walked away for a reason. The missions had taken too much, cost too many lives, left me with nights full of screams I couldn't forget. But then the doubt turned into something sharper, resolve. If Hayes was in there, pinned or bleeding, he didn't have long. By the time I hit the perimeter, it was chaos, sirens blaring, smoke billowing from the twisted steel of what used to be a manufacturing plant. Police tape flapped in the wind, holding back bystanders and press. But the second I flashed my laminated ID, the officers moved aside without a word. I could feel eyes on me as I crossed into the restricted zone, my boots crunching over glass and debris. The smell of burning insulation hit me like a wall. I grabbed my radio again. "Valkyrie on site," I said. Reyes' voice came back through the crackle. "Northwest corner, 2nd floor, if it's still standing." I tightened the straps on my vest, adjusted my mask, and started moving. Inside, it was worse than I'd imagined. Partial collapses everywhere, chunks of concrete hanging by twisted rebar, water from burst pipes mixing with dust and blood. A firefighter grabbed my arm, shouting over the noise. "You can't go in there. It's not stable." I just shook my head and kept going. You don't tell Unit Valkyrie who she can't save. I found my way to a broken stairwell, where a metal beam created a narrow crawl space up to what was left of the 2nd floor. The heat was intense, the air thick enough to choke on, but I pushed through, calling Hayes' name as I moved. I found him in what had once been an office, half buried under a section of wall. Blood soaked his uniform from a deep gash in his side, his face pale and slick with sweat. "About damn time," he rasped when he saw me, and even in that moment, I felt my throat tighten. "Couldn't let you have all the fun," I said, dropping to my knees beside him. I did a quick assessment. Leg pinned, likely fractured, internal bleeding. Tom wasn't on our side. I called it in. Found him. "Need extraction now." The response was grim. "Building's unstable. You've got 60 seconds before we pull out." 60 seconds. That was nothing. I worked faster than I'd ever worked in my life, wedging an inflatable lift bag under the slab and pumping air until it shifted just enough to drag him free. The building groaned like a living thing above us, dust raining down. "We're moving," I told him, hooking my arm under his and pulling with every ounce of strength I had left. We staggered back toward the stairwell, my muscles screaming, the world narrowing down to the sound of our boots and the crack of breaking beams. Just as we reached the opening, a deafening roar ripped through the air, the ceiling giving way. I shoved him forward, throwing myself after him as the floor behind us disappeared into a cloud of smoke and fire. We hit the ground level hard, coughing, but alive. I could hear Reyes shouting my name over the radio, but all I could focus on was Hayes, his breathing shallow but steady. "You're gonna be okay," I told him, though part of me knew it was as much for me as it was for him. The medics swarmed in, and as they took him away, I stood there in the chaos, realizing something I hadn't wanted to admit. No matter how much I tried to walk away, Unit Valkyrie was still inside me, waiting for the moment she was needed. And she'd just been called back into the fight. The chaos outside the plant was deafening, sirens screaming, radios crackling, shouted orders cutting through the smoke-filled air, but all I heard was the thundering in my own chest as I pushed through the crowd toward the triage area where they'd taken Hayes. He was conscious but fading, a paramedic pressing gauze hard into his side, the bandages already crimson. I didn't even ask permission. I knelt beside him and snapped on fresh gloves, taking over the pressure point and checking his airway. His eyes found mine, glassy but stubborn. "Still got it," he muttered, and even bleeding out he managed a ghost of a smirk. "Always," I said, but my voice was tight. The medevac team was running late. A down power line had blocked their landing zone. So now the plan was to move him through the perimeter to an ambulance staged 3 blocks away. I glanced at the crowd beyond the barricades. Too many civilians, too many reporters, too many curious eyes that didn't need to see a bleeding man who'd been part of missions they weren't clear to know existed. "We can't roll him through there like this," I told Reyes when he jogged up. He was older now, lines cut deep into his face, but the urgency in his eyes was the same as I remembered. "Options are thin," he said, scanning the chaos. "We need to move, Ava." I hated hearing my real name in that tone. It meant time was almost gone. My mind worked fast, mapping the area. There was an alley on the north side, narrow enough to avoid the press, but just wide enough for a gurney. It meant going past the unstable side of the plant, but I trusted my instincts more than the safety perimeter some overworked lieutenant had drawn on a map. "We go north," I said, not asking for approval. Reyes didn't argue. I helped load Hayes onto the gurney, my hands never leaving his wound, and the 4 of us, 2 medics, Reyes, and me, started moving. The air back there was worse, thick with the smell of chemicals, but it was quiet, away from the chaos, until the quiet turned dangerous. A metallic groan rolled through the alley, and I realized part of the plant's outer wall was still shifting. "Move," I shouted, and the medics broke into a jog, the gurney wheels clattering over cracked pavement. A chunk of steel fell close enough to send dust into my eyes, but we kept going, every second stretching longer. Halfway through, Hayes gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Not your fight anymore," he rasped. "Yeah," I said, pushing his hand back to the rail. "Tell me that when you're standing again." We broke out of the alley into the waiting ambulance bay, the medics hauling him inside. I climbed in after them, but Reyes caught my arm before I could sit. "You did enough," he said quietly. "Go back to your life." The doors closed between us before I could answer, and just like that, the adrenaline began to drain, leaving me with the familiar, dangerous itch in my blood. I stood there watching the ambulance roar away, feeling the tug of 2 worlds, the one I'd built for myself, and the one I'd sworn off but could never quite sever. I turned to leave when my radio crackled again, softer this time, a voice I didn't recognize. Valkyrie, we have additional casualties reported, Northeast Quadrant, requesting immediate medic support. I froze. That wasn't part of the plan. The official crews were already stretched thin, but why were they calling me specifically? My hand hovered over the radio, and in that moment, I realized something. Word had spread. The second I answered that first call, I'd stepped back into the circle, and now I was on the list again. I could walk away. I could go back to the community center, finish my lesson, pretend this day never happened. But the thing about pretending is it doesn't stop the nightmares, and it sure as hell doesn't stop the guilt. Without another word, I adjusted my gear and started running northeast, back toward the dust and danger. The streets here were eerily empty, the smoke hanging low, muting the sunlight. I rounded the corner and found them. 2 plant workers, one barely conscious, the other trapped under a beam too heavy to move alone. "Hang on," I called, dropping to my knees beside the conscious one. His face was pale, breathing shallow, shock setting in fast. I tore open my kit, starting in 4 while scanning for hazards. That's when I noticed the quiet was too quiet. No sirens, no shouts, just the faint ticking of cooling metal and the creak of something overhead. I looked up and saw it. The skeletal remains of the plant's roof, swaying with every breath of wind. One wrong move, and it would come down on all 3 of us. I worked faster, adrenaline sharpening my focus. The 4 took, color returning to his cheeks just enough for him to grip my wrist. "My brother," he whispered, nodding toward the man pinned under the beam. "Don't leave him." I met his eyes. "I'm not leaving either of you." My harness was already in my hands, the rope snaking around the beam. I anchored it to a twisted support column, praying it would hold, then began levering the beam up inch by inch. My shoulders screamed, my gloves cutting into my skin, but finally there was enough clearance to drag him out. The pinned man gasped in pain, his leg bent at an angle it wasn't meant to go, but he was breathing. I splinted it fast, then turned back to the first man. "You both with me?" I asked, and they nodded weakly. I slung one arm over each shoulder and started the slow, brutal walkout, the roof groaning louder with every step. We'd just cleared the edge of the structure when it gave way behind us, a deafening crash that sent a wave of hot dust over our backs. My lungs burned, my knees shook, but when I finally set them down on the safe side of the barricade, they were alive. The medics took over, shouting thanks, but I barely heard them. I stood there in the settling dust, my heart still pounding, and knew the truth. This wasn't a one-time thing. They would keep calling me, and I would keep answering, because no matter how far I ran, Unit Valkyrie wasn't just who I was, it was who I am. The sun was dipping low by the time the last of the survivors were evacuated, painting the smoke in shades of orange and blood red, like the sky couldn't decide whether the day had been won or lost. I stood at the edge of the cordon, gear hanging heavy on my shoulders, watching as the ambulances and fire trucks rolled away one by one, their sirens fading into the distance. My gloves were stiff with dried blood, some mine, most not, and every muscle in my body ached in that deep, satisfying way that only comes after you've pushed yourself past every reasonable limit. Reyes found me there, his face smudged with soot, his eyes tired but sharper than I'd seen them in years. "Hayes made it," he said without preamble. The knot in my chest loosened. "They got him into surgery. Docs think he'll keep the leg." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the kind that takes a piece of tension with it on the way out. "Good," I said, but my voice caught on the word. Reyes studied me for a moment, then handed me something small, a battered, sand-colored patch with my old unit insignia. I stared at it, running my thumb over the frayed edges. "Didn't think I'd ever see this again," I murmured. "Didn't think you'd earn it again," he replied, but his tone wasn't sharp. It was respectful. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his truck, leaving me with the patch and the fading hum of the day's chaos. I should have left then, gone back to the quiet safety of the community center, maybe finished my class and laughed off the strange radio call as a misunderstanding. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself drifting toward the temporary command post where the radios were still alive with chatter. My own radio, clipped to my vest, crackled again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "Unit Valkyrie, you still up?" a voice asked. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the transmit button. "Yeah," I finally said. "I'm here." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Copy. Just wanted to say, you saved more people today than we had any right to hope for. We owe you." The line went quiet after that, but I kept the radio pressed to my ear for a moment longer, letting the words sink in. My mind flashed to the faces. Hayes, the two brothers, the strangers who had clung to me in the smoke like I was their only chance. And maybe, in those moments, I had been. I walked back to my truck slowly, the weight of the day pressing down but not crushing me. When I reached it, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring at the duffel bag on the passenger side. The zipper was still open, the gear inside streaked with dust and sweat, the tools of a life I'd sworn off. I thought about sealing it again, locking it away for another 5 years. But instead, I reached for the radio, turned the volume down low, and left it resting on the seat beside me. As the engine rumbled to life, the last of the daylight catching in the mirror, I realized the truth wasn't that I'd been called back into the fight. The truth was that I'd never really left. Somewhere out there, someone would need Unit Valkyrie again, and when they did, I'd answer. Because no matter how far you run, some parts of yourself aren't meant to be left behind. They're meant to be carried, ready, for the moment the world cracks open and someone calls your name. And as I drove away into the cooling night, the radio gave one last quiet call. "Unit Valkyrie, thank you for your service. Over and out." I didn't reply. I just smiled, knowing they'd hear me when it mattered.